Part 2, Chapter 7 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Janet West. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 7, Afternoon at Timothy's. If old Jolyon, as he got into his cab, had said, "I won't believe a word of it," he would more truthfully have expressed his sentiments. The notion that James and his womankind had seen him in the company of his son had awakened in him not only the impatience he had always felt when crossed, but that secret hostility natural between brothers, the roots of which, little nursery rivalries, sometimes toughen and deepen as life goes on, and, all hidden, support a plant capable of producing in season the bitterest fruits. Hitherto there had been between these 6 brothers no more unfriendly feeling than caused by the secret and natural doubt that the others might be richer than themselves, a feeling increased to the pitch of curiosity by the approach of death, that end of all handicaps, and the great closeness of their man of business, who, with some sagacity, would profess to Nicholas ignorance of James's income, to James ignorance of old Jolyon's, to Jolyon ignorance of Roger's, to Roger ignorance of Swithin's, while to Swithin he would say most irritatingly that Nicholas must be a rich man. Timothy alone was exempt, being in gilt-edged securities. But now, between the 2 of them at least, had arisen a very different sense of injury. From the moment when James had the impertinence to pry into his affairs, as he put it, old Jolyon no longer chose to credit this story about Bosinney. His granddaughter slighted through a member of that fellow's family? He made up his mind that Bosinney was maligned. There must be some other reason for his defection. June had flown out at him or something. She was as touchy as she could be. He would, however, let Timothy have a bit of his mind, and see if he would go on dropping hints. And he would not let the grass grow under his feet either. He would go there at once, and take very good care that he didn't have to go again on the same errand. He saw James's carriage blocking the pavement in front of the Bower. So they had got there before him, cackling about having seen him, he dared say. And further on, Swithin's greys were turning their noses towards the noses of James's bays, as though in conclave over the family, while their coachmen were in conclave above. Old Jolyon, depositing his hat on the chair in the narrow hall, where the hat of Bosinney's had so long ago been mistaken for a cat, passed his thin hand grimly over his face with its great drooping white moustaches, as though to remove all traces of expression, and made his way upstairs. He found the front drawing-room full. It was full enough at the best of times, without visitors, without anyone in it, for Timothy and his sisters, following the tradition of their generation, considered that a room was not quite nice unless it was properly furnished. It held, therefore, 11 chairs, a sofa, 3 tables, 2 cabinets, innumerable knick-knacks, and a part of a large grand piano. And now, occupied by Mrs. Small, Aunt Hester, by Swithin, James, Rachel, Winifred, Euphemia, who had come in again to return Passion and Paregoric, which she had read at lunch, and her chum Frances, Roger's daughter, the musical Forsyte, the one who composed songs. There was only 1 chair left unoccupied, except, of course, the 2 that nobody ever sat on, and the only standing room was occupied by the cat, on whom old Jolyon promptly stepped. In these days it was by no means unusual for Timothy to have so many visitors. The family had always, one and all, had a real respect for Aunt Anne, and now that she was gone, they were coming far more frequently to the Bower, and staying longer. Swithin had been the first to arrive, and seated torpid in a red satin chair with a gilt back, he gave every appearance of lasting the others out. And symbolizing Bosinney's name, the big one, with his great stature and bulk, his thick white hair, his puffy, immovable, shaven face, he looked more primeval than ever in the highly upholstered room. His conversation, as usual of late, had turned at once upon Irene, and he had lost no time in giving Aunt Julian Hester his opinion with regard to this rumour he had heard going about. No, as he said, she might want a bit of flirtation, A pretty woman must have her fling, but more than that he did not believe. Nothing open. She had too much good sense, too much proper appreciation of what was due to her position, and to the family. No he was going to say scandal, but the very idea was so preposterous that he waved his hand as though to say, but let that pass. Granted that Swithin took a bachelor's view of this situation. Still, what indeed was not due to that family in which so many had done so well for themselves, had attained a certain position? If he had heard in dark, pessimistic moments the words yeoman and very small beer used in connection with his origin, did he believe them? No. He cherished, hugging it pathetically to his bosom, the secret theory that there was something distinguished somewhere in his ancestry. "Must be," he once said to young Jolyon, before the latter went to the bad. "Look at us we've got on. There must be good blood in us somewhere." He had been fond of young Jolyon. The boy had been in a good set at college, had known that old ruffian Sir Charles Fist's sons, a pretty rascal one of them had turned out too, and there was a style about him. It was 1,000 pities he had run off with that half-foreign governess. If he must go off like that, why couldn't he have chosen someone who would have done them credit? And what was he now? An underwriter at Lloyd's. They said he even painted pictures. Pictures! Damn, he might have ended as Sir Jolyon Forsyte, Baronet, with a seat in Parliament, and a place in the country. It was Swithin who, following the impulse which sooner or later urges thereto some member of every great family, went to the Herald's office, where they assured him that he was undoubtedly of the same family as the well-known Forsytes with an I, whose arms were 3 dexter buckles on a sable ground gules, hoping no doubt to get him to take them up. Swithin, however, did not do this, but having ascertained that the crest was a pheasant proper, and the motto "For Forsyte," he had the pheasant proper placed upon his carriage and the buttons of his coachman, and both crest and motto were on his writing paper. The arms he hugged to himself, partly because, not having paid for them, he thought it would look ostentatious to put them on his carriage, and he hated ostentation, and partly because he, like any practical man all over the country, had a secret dislike and contempt for things he could not understand. He found it hard, as anyone might, to swallow 3 dexter buckles on a sable ground gules. He never forgot, however, their having told him that if he paid for them he would be entitled to use them, and it strengthened his conviction that he was a gentleman. Imperceptibly, the rest of the family absorbed the pheasant proper, and some, more serious than others, adopted the motto. Old Jolyon, however, refused to use the latter, saying that it was humbug, meaning nothing, so far as he could see. Among the older generation it was perhaps known at bottom from what great historical event they derived their crest, and if pressed on the subject, sooner than tell a lie — they did not like telling lies, having an impression that only Frenchmen and Russians told them — they would confess hurriedly that Swithin had got hold of it somehow. Among the younger generation the matter was wrapped in discretion proper. They did not want to hurt the feelings of their elders, nor to feel ridiculous themselves. They simply used the crest. No, said Swithin, he had had an opportunity of seeing for himself, and what he should say was, that there was nothing in her manner to that young buccaneer, or Bassini, or whatever his name was, different in her manner to himself. In fact, he should rather say... But here the entrance of Francis and Euphemia put an unfortunate stop to the conversation, for this was not a subject which could be discussed before young people. And though Swithin was somewhat upset at being stopped like this on a point of saying something so important, he soon recovered his affability. He was rather fond of Frances, Francie, as she was called in the family. She was so smart, and they told him she made a pretty little pot of pin money by her songs. He called it very clever of her. He rather prided himself indeed on a liberal attitude towards women, not seeing any reason why they shouldn't paint pictures or write tunes, or books even, for the matter of that, especially if they could turn a useful penny by it. Not at all. Kept them out of mischief. It was not as if they were men. Little Francie, as she was usually called with good-natured contempt, was an important personage, if only as a standing illustration of the attitude of Forsytes towards the arts. She was not really little, but rather tall, with dark hair for a Forsyte, which, together with a grey eye, gave her what was called a Celtic appearance. She wrote songs with titles like Breathing Sighs, or Kiss Me, Mother, ere I die, with a refrain like an anthem. Kiss me, mother, ere I die. Kiss me, mother. Ah, kiss me, kiss me, mother, ere I die. She wrote the words to them herself, and other poems. In lighter moments she wrote waltzes, one of which, the Kensington Coil, was almost national to Kensington, having a sweet dip in it. It was very original. Then there were her songs for little people, at once educational and witty, especially Grandma's Porgy, and that ditty, almost prophetically imbued with the coming imperial spirit, entitled Black Him in His Little Eye. Any publisher would take these, and reviews like High Living and the Ladies' Genteel Guide went into raptures over another of Miss Francie Forsyte's spirited ditties, sparkling and pathetic. We ourselves were moved to tears and laughter. Miss Forsyte should go far. With the true instinct of her breed, Francie had made a point of knowing the right people who would write about her, and talk about her, and people in society too, keeping a mental register of just where to exert her fascinations, and an eye on that steady scale of rising prices, which in her mind's eye represented the future. In this way she caused herself to be universally respected. Once, at a time when her emotions were whipped by an attachment, for the tenor of Roger's life, with its whole-hearted collection of house property, had induced in his only daughter a tendency towards passion, she turned to great and sincere work, choosing the sonata form for the violin. This was the only one of her productions that troubled the Forsytes. They felt at once that it would not sell. Roger, who liked having a clever daughter well enough, and often alluded to the amount of pocket money she made for herself, was upset by this violin sonata. Rubbish like that, he called it. Francie had borrowed young Flageoletti from Euphemia to play it in the drawing-room at Prince's Gardens. As a matter of fact, Roger was right. It was rubbish, but annoying, the sort of rubbish that wouldn't sell. As every Forsyte knows, rubbish that sells is not rubbish at all. Far from it. And yet, in spite of the sound common sense which fixed the worth of art at what it would fetch, some of the Forsytes, Aunt Hester for instance, who had always been musical, could not help regretting that Francie's music was not classical. The same with her poems. But then, as Aunt Hester said, they didn't see any poetry nowadays. All the poems were light little things. There was nobody who could write a poem like Paradise Lost or Childe Harold, either of which made you feel that you really had read something. Still, it was nice for Francie to have something to occupy her. While other girls were spending money shopping, she was making it. And both Aunt Hester and Aunt Julie were always ready to listen to the latest story of how Francie had got her price increased. They listened now, together with Swithin, who sat pretending not to, for these young people talked so fast and mumbled so he could never catch what they said. "And I can't think," said Mrs. Septimus, "how you do it. I should never have the audacity." Francie smiled lightly. "I'd much rather deal with a man than a woman. Women are so sharp." "My dear!" cried Mrs. Small, "I'm sure we are not." Euphemia went off into her silent laugh, and, ending with the squeak, said as though being strangled, "Oh, you'll kill me some day, auntie." Swithin saw no necessity to laugh. He detested people laughing when he himself perceived no joke. Indeed, he detested Euphemia altogether, to whom he always alluded as Nick's daughter, what she called the pale one. He had just missed being her godfather, indeed would have been, had he not taken a firm stand against her outlandish name. He hated becoming a godfather. Swithin then said to Francie with dignity, "It's a fine day, for the time of year." But Euphemia, who knew perfectly well that he had refused to be her godfather, turned to Aunt Hester and began telling her how she had seen Irene, Mrs. Soames, at the church and commercial stores. "And Soames was with her?" said Aunt Hester, to whom Mrs. Small had as yet no opportunity of relating the incident. "Soames with her? Of course not." "But was she all alone in London?" "Oh no, there was Mr. Bosinney with her. She was perfectly dressed." But Swithin, hearing the name Irene, looked severely at Euphemia, who, it is true, never did look well in a dress, whatever she may have done on other occasions, and said, "Dressed like a lady, I've no doubt. It's a pleasure to see her." At this moment James and his daughters were announced. Darty, feeling badly in want of a drink, had pleaded an appointment with his dentist, and, being put down at the Marble Arch, had got into a hansom, and was already seated in the window of his club in Piccadilly. His wife, he told his cronies, had wanted to take him to pay some calls. It was not in his line, not exactly. Haw! Hailing the waiter, he sent him out to the hall to see what he had won in the 4:30 race. He was dog-tired, he said, and that was a fact. Had been driving about with his wife to shows all the afternoon. Had put his foot down at last. A fellow must live his own life. At this moment, glancing out of the bay window, for he loved this seat whence he could see everybody pass, his eye unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, chanced to light on the figure of Soames, who was mousing across the road from the Green Park side, with the evident intention of coming in, for he too belonged to the Iseeum. Darty sprang to his feet. Grasping his glass, he muttered something about that 4:30 race, and swiftly withdrew to the card-room, where Soames never came. Here, in complete isolation and dim light, he lived his own life till 7:30, by which hour he knew Soames must certainly have left the club. It would not do, as he kept repeating to himself whenever he felt the impulse to join the gossips in the bay window getting too strong for him. It absolutely would not do, with finances as low as his, and the old man James rusty ever since that business over the oil shares, which was no fault of his, to risk a row with Winifred. If Soames were to see him in the club, it would be sure to come round to her that he wasn't at the dentist's at all. He never knew a family where things came round so. Uneasily, amongst the green baize card tables, a frown on his olive-coloured face, his checked trousers crossed, and patent leather boots shining through the gloom, he sat biting his forefinger, and wondering where the deuce he was to get the money if Erotic failed to win the Lancashire Cup. His thoughts turned gloomily to the Forsytes. What a set they were! There was no getting anything out of them. At least, it was a matter of extreme difficulty. They were so particular about money matters. Not a sportsman amongst the lot, unless it were George. That fellow Soames, for instance, would have a fit if you tried to borrow a tenner from him. Or, if he didn't have a fit, he looked at you with his cursed supercilious smile, as if you were a lost soul because you were in want of money. And that wife of his! Darty's mouth watered involuntarily. He had tried to be on good terms with her, as one naturally would with any pretty sister-in-law, but he would be cursed if he mentally used a coarse word, would have anything to say to him. She looked at him, indeed, as if he were dirt, and yet she would go far enough, he wouldn't mind betting. He knew women. They weren't made with soft eyes and figures like that for nothing, as that fellow Soames would jolly soon find out, if there were anything in what he had heard about this buccaneer Johnny. Rising from his chair, Darty took a turn across the room, ending in front of the looking-glass over the marble chimney-piece, and there he stood for a long time contemplating in the glass the reflection of his face. It had that look, peculiar to some men, of having been steeped in linseed oil, with its waxed dark moustaches, and the little distinguished commencements of side whiskers, and concernedly he felt the promise of a pimple on the side of his slightly curved and fattish nose. In the meantime, old Jolyon had found the remaining chair in Timothy's commodious drawing-room. His advent had obviously put a stop to the conversation, decided awkwardness having set in. Aunt Julie, with her well-known kind-heartedness, hastened to set people at their ease again. "Yes, Jolyon," she said, "we were just saying that you haven't been here for a long time, but we mustn't be surprised. You're busy, of course. James was just saying what a busy time of year—" "Was he?" said old Jolyon, looking hard at James. "It wouldn't be half so busy if everybody minded their own business." James, brooding in a small chair from which his knees ran uphill, shifted his feet uneasily and put one of them down on the cat, which had unwisely taken refuge from old Jolyon beside him. "Here, you've got a cat here," he said in an injured voice, withdrawing his foot nervously as he felt it squish into the soft furry body. "Several," said old Jolyon, looking at one face and another. "I trod on one just now." A silence followed. Then Mrs. Small, twisting her fingers and gazing round with pathetic calm, said, "And how is dear June?" A twinkle of humour shot through the sternness of old Jolyon's eyes. "Extraordinary old woman, Julie. No one quite like her for saying the wrong thing." "Bad," he said. "London don't agree with her. Too many people about, too much clatter and chatter by half." He laid emphasis on the words, and again looked James in the face. Nobody spoke. A feeling of its being too dangerous to take a step in any direction, or hazard any remark, had fallen on all of them. Something of the sense of the impending that comes over the spectator of a Greek tragedy had entered that upholstered room, filled with those white-haired, frock-coated old men and fashionably attired women, who were all of the same blood, between all of whom existed an unseizable resemblance. Not that they were conscious of it. The visits of such fateful, bitter spirits are only felt. Then Swithin rose. He would not sit there feeling like that. He was not to be put down by anyone. And manoeuvring round the room with added pomp, he shook hands with each separately. "You tell Timothy from me," he said, "that he coddles himself too much." Then, turning to Francie, whom he considered smart, he added, "You come with me for a drive one of these days." But this conjured up the vision of that other eventful drive which had been so much talked about, and he stood quite still for a second, with glassy eyes, as though waiting to catch up with the significance of what he himself had said. Then, suddenly recollecting that he didn't care a damn, he turned to old Jolyon. "Well, good-bye, Jolyon. You shouldn't go about without an overcoat. You'll be getting sciatica or something." And, kicking the cat slightly with the pointed tip of his patent leather boot, he took his huge form away. When he had gone, everyone looked secretly at the others, to see how they had taken the mention of the word drive, the word which had become famous, and acquired an overwhelming importance as the only official, so to speak, news in connection with the vague and sinister rumour clinging to the family tongue. Euphemia, yielding to an impulse, said with a short laugh, "I'm glad Uncle Swithin doesn't ask me to go for drives." Mrs. Small, to reassure her and smooth over any little awkwardness the subject might have, replied, "My dear, he likes to take somebody well dressed, who will do him a little credit. I shall never forget the drive he took me. It was an experience." And her chubby round face was spread for a moment with a strange contentment, then broke into pouts, and tears came into her eyes. She was thinking of that long-ago driving tour she had once taken with Septimus Small. James, who had relapsed into his nervous brooding in the little chair, suddenly roused himself. "He's a funny fellow, Swithin," he said, but in a half-hearted way. Old Jolyon's silence, his stern eyes, held them all in a kind of paralysis. He was disconcerted himself by the effect of his own words, an effect which seemed to deepen the importance of the very rumour he had come to scotch, but he was still angry. He had not done with them yet. No, no, he would give them another rub or two. He did not wish to rub his nieces, he had no quarrel with them. A young and presentable female always appealed to old Jolyon's clemency. But that fellow James, and, in a less degree perhaps, those others, deserved all they would get, and he too asked for Timothy. As though feeling that some danger threatened her younger brother, Aunt Julie suddenly offered him tea. "There it is," she said, "all cold and nasty, waiting for you in the back drawing-room, but Smither shall make you some fresh." Old Jolyon rose. "Thank you," he said, looking straight at James, "but I've no time for tea, and scandal, and the rest of it. It's time I was home. Good-bye, Julia. Good-bye, Hester. Good-bye, Winifred." Without more ceremonious adieu, he marched out. Once again in his cab, his anger evaporated, for so it ever was with his wrath. When he had rapped out, it was gone. Sadness came over his spirit. He had stopped their mouths, maybe, but at what a cost! At the cost of certain knowledge that the rumour he had been resolved not to believe was true. June was abandoned, and for the wife of that fellow's son. He felt it was true, and hardened himself to treat it as if it were not. But the pain he hid beneath this resolution began slowly, surely, to vent itself in a blind resentment against James and his son. The 6 women and 1 man left behind in the little drawing-room began talking as easily as might be after such an occurrence, for though each one of them knew for a fact that he or she never talked scandal, each one of them also knew that the other 6 did. All were therefore angry and at a loss. James only was silent, disturbed, to the bottom of his soul. Presently Francie said, "Do you know, I think Uncle Jolyon is terribly changed this last year. What do you think, Aunt Hester?" Aunt Hester made a little movement of recoil. "Oh, ask your Aunt Julia," she said. "I know nothing about it." No one else was afraid of assenting, and James muttered gloomily at the floor. "He's not half the man he was." "I've noticed it a long time," went on Francie. "He's aged tremendously." Aunt Julie shook her head. Her face seemed suddenly to have become one immense pout. "Poor dear Jolyon," she said. "Somebody ought to see to it for him." There was again silence. Then, as though in terror of being left solitarily behind, all 5 visitors rose simultaneously, and took their departure. Mrs. Small, Aunt Hester, and their cat were left once more alone. The sound of a door closing in the distance announced the approach of Timothy. That evening, when Aunt Hester had just got off to sleep in the back bedroom that used to be Aunt Julie's before Aunt Julie took Aunt Ann's, her door was opened, and Mrs. Small, in a pink nightcap, a candle in her hand, entered. "Hester!" she said. "Hester!" Aunt Hester faintly rustled the sheet. "Hester!" repeated Aunt Julie, to make quite sure she had awakened her. "I am quite troubled about poor dear Jolyon." "What," Aunt Julie dwelt on the word, "do you think ought to be done?" Aunt Hester again rustled the sheet. Her voice was heard faintly pleading. "Done? How should I know?" Aunt Julie turned away satisfied, and closing the door with extra gentleness so as not to disturb dear Hester, let it slip through her fingers and fall to with a crack. Back in her own room, she stood at the window gazing at the moon over the trees in the park, through a chink in the muslin curtains, close drawn lest anyone should see. And there, with her face all round and pouting in its pink cap, and her eyes wet, she thought of dear Jolyon, so old and so lonely, and how she could be of some use to him, and how he would come to love her, as she had never been loved since poor Septimus went away. End of Part 2, Chapter 7. Recording by Janet West.
Chapter 8 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 8. Dance at Roger's. Roger's house in Princess Gardens was brilliantly alight. Large numbers of wax candles had been collected and placed in cut-glass chandeliers, and the parquet floor of the long, double drawing-room reflected these constellations. An appearance of real spaciousness had been secured by moving out all the furniture onto the upper landings, and enclosing the room with those strange appendages of civilization known as rout seats. In a remote corner, embowered in palms, was a cottage piano, with a copy of the Kensington Coil open on the music stand. Roger had objected to a band. He didn't see in the least what they wanted with a band. He wouldn't go to the expense, and there was an end of it. Francie, her mother, whom Roger had long since reduced to chronic dyspepsia, went to bed on such occasions, had been obliged to content herself with supplementing the piano by a young man who played the cornet, and she so arranged with palms that anyone who did not look into the heart of things might imagine there were several musicians secreted there. She made up her mind to tell them to play loud. There was a lot of music in a cornet, if the man would only put his soul into it. In the more cultivated American tongue, she was through at last, through that tortuous labyrinth of makeshifts, which must be traversed before fashionable display can be combined with the sound economy of a Forsyte. Thin but brilliant, in her maize-coloured frock with much tulle about the shoulders, she went from place to place, fitting on her gloves and casting her eyes over it all. To the hired butler, for Roger only kept maids, she spoke about the wine. Did he quite understand that Mr. Forsyte wished a dozen bottles of the champagne from Whiteley's to be put out? But if that were finished, she did not suppose it would be, most of the ladies would drink water, no doubt. But if it were, there was a champagne cup, and he must do the best he could with that. She hated having to say this sort of thing to a butler, it was so infra-dig. But what could you do with father? Roger, indeed, after making himself consistently disagreeable about the dance, would come down presently, with his fresh colour and bumpy forehead, as though he had been its promoter, and he would smile, and probably take the prettiest woman in to supper, and at 2 o'clock, just as they were getting into the swing, He would go up secretly to the musicians and tell them to play "God Save the Queen" and go away. Francie devoutly hoped he might soon get tired and slip off to bed. The 3 or 4 devoted girl friends who were staying in the house for this dance had partaken with her in a small abandoned room upstairs of tea and cold chicken legs, hurriedly served. The men had been sent out to dine at Eustace's club, it being felt that they must be fed up. Punctually on the stroke of 9 arrived Mrs. Small alone. She made elaborate apologies for the absence of Timothy, omitting all mention of Aunt Hester, who, at the last minute, had said she could not be bothered. Francie received her effusively and placed her on a rout seat, where she left her pouting and solitary in lavender-coloured satin, the first time she had worn colour since Aunt Ann's death. The devoted maiden friends came now from their rooms, each by magic arrangement in a differently coloured frock, but all with the same liberal allowance of tulle on the shoulders and at the bosom, for they were, by some fatality, lean to a girl. They were all taken up to Mrs. Small. None stayed with her more than a few seconds, but clustering together talked and twisted their programmes, looking secretly at the door for the first appearance of a man. Then arrived in a group a number of Nicholases, always punctual, the fashion up Ladbroke Grove way, and close behind them Eustace and his men, gloomy and smelling rather of smoke. 3 or 4 of Francie's lovers now appeared, one after the other. She had made each promise to come early. They were all clean-shaven and sprightly, with that peculiar kind of young man's sprightliness which had recently invaded Kensington. They did not seem to mind each other's presence in the least, and wore their ties bunching out at the ends, white waistcoats, and socks with clocks. All had handkerchiefs concealed in their cuffs. They moved buoyantly, each armoured in professional gaiety, as though he had come to do great deeds. Their faces when they danced, far from wearing the traditional solemn look of the dancing Englishman, were irresponsible, charming, suave. They bounded, twirling their partners at great pace, without pedantic attention to the rhythm of music. At other dancers they looked with a kind of airy scorn, they, the Light Brigade, the heroes of 100 Kensington hops, from whom alone could the right manner and smile and step be hoped. After this the stream came fast, chaperons silting up against the wall facing the entrance, the volatile element swelling the eddy in the larger room. Men were scarce, and wallflowers wore their peculiar pathetic expression, a patient, sourish smile which seemed to say, "Oh no, don't mistake me. I know you are not coming up to me. I can hardly expect that." And Francie would plead with one of her lovers, or with some callow youth, "Now, to please me, do let me introduce you to Miss Pink. Such a nice girl, really." And she would bring him up and say, "Miss Pink, Mr. Gathercole, can you spare him a dance?" Then Miss Pink, smiling her forced smile, colouring a little, answered, "Oh, I think so," and screening her empty card, wrote on it the name of Gathercole, spelling it passionately in the district that he proposed, about the second extra. But when the youth had murmured that it was hot, and passed, she relapsed into her attitude of hopeless expectation, into her patient sourish smile. Mothers, slowly fanning their faces, watched their daughters, and in their eyes could be read all of the story of those daughters' fortunes. As for themselves, to sit hour after hour, dead tired, silent, or talking spasmodically, what did it matter, so long as the girls were having a good time? But to see them neglected and passed by, ah! They smiled, but their eyes stabbed like the eyes of an offended swan. They longed to pluck young Gathercole by the slack of his dandified breeches and drag him to their daughters, the jackanapes. And all the cruelties and hardness of life, its pathos and unequal chances, its conceit, self-forgetfulness, and patience, were presented on the battlefield of this Kensington ballroom. Here and there, too, lovers, not like Francie's, a peculiar breed, but simply lovers, trembling, blushing, silent, sought each other by flying glances, sought to meet and touch in the maze of the dance, and now and again dancing together, struck some beholder by the light in their eyes. Not a second before 10 o'clock came the Jameses. Emily, Rachel, Winifred (Dartie had been left behind, having on a former occasion drunk too much of Roger's champagne), and Cicely, the youngest, making her debut. Behind them, following in a hansom from the paternal mansion where they had dined, Soames and Irene. All these ladies had shoulder straps and no tulle, thus showing at once, by a bolder exposure of flesh, that they came from the more fashionable side of the park. Soames, sidling back from the contact of the dancers, took up a position against the wall. Guarding himself with his pale smile, he stood watching. Waltz after waltz began and ended, couple after couple brushed by with smiling lips, laughter and snatches of talk, or with set lips and eyes searching the throng, or again with silent parted lips and eyes on each other. And the scent of festivity, the odor of flowers and hair, of essences that women love, rose suffocatingly in the heat of the summer night. Silent, with something of scorn in his smile, Soames seemed to notice nothing, but now and again his eyes, finding that which they sought, would fix themselves on a point in the shifting throng, and the smile die off his lips. He danced with no one. Some fellows danced with their wives. His sense of form had never permitted him to dance with Irene since their marriage, and the god of the Forsytes alone can tell whether this was a relief to him or not. She passed, dancing with other men, her dress, iris-coloured, floating away from her feet. She danced well. He was tired of hearing women say with an acid smile, "How beautifully your wife dances, Mr. Forsyte. It's quite a pleasure to watch her." Tired of answering them with his sidelong glance, "You think so?" A young couple close by flirted a fan by turns, making an unpleasant draught. Francie and one of her lovers stood near. They were talking of love. He heard Roger's voice behind, giving an order about supper to a servant. Everything was very second class. He wished that he had not come. He had asked Irene whether she wanted him. She had answered with that maddening smile of hers, "Oh, no." Why had he come? For the last quarter of an hour he had not even seen her. Here was George advancing with his quilpish face. It was too late to get out of his way. "Have you seen the Buccaneer?" said this licensed wag. "He's on the war-path, hair-cut and everything." Soames said he had not, and crossing the room, half empty in an interval of the dance, he went out on the balcony and looked down into the street. A carriage had driven up with late arrivals, and round the door hung some of those patient watchers of the London streets who spring up to the call of lighter music. Their faces, pale and upturned above their black and rusty figures, had an air of stolid watching that annoyed Soames. Why were they allowed to hang about? Why didn't the bobby move them on? But the policeman took no notice of them. His feet were planted apart on the strip of crimson carpet stretched across the pavement. His face under the helmet wore the same stolid, watching look as theirs. Across the road, through the railings, Soames could see the branches of trees shining, faintly stirring in the breeze, by the gleam of the street lamps. Beyond again the upper lights of the houses on the other side, so many eyes looking down on the quiet blackness of the garden, and over all the sky, that wonderful London sky, dusted with the innumerable reflection of countless lamps, a dome woven over between its stars with the refraction of human needs and human fancies, immense mirror of pomp and misery that night after night stretches its kindly mocking over miles of houses and gardens, mansions and squalor, over Forsytes, policemen, and patient watchers in the streets. Soames turned away, and hidden in the recess, gazed into the lighted room. It was cooler out there. He saw the new arrivals, June and her grandfather, enter. What had made them so late? They stood by the doorway. They looked fagged. Fancy Uncle Jolyon turning out at this time of night. Why hadn't June come to Irene as she usually did? And it occurred to him suddenly that he had seen nothing of June for a long time now. Watching her face with idle malice, he saw it change, grow so pale that he thought she would drop, then flame out crimson. Turning to see at what she was looking, he saw his wife on Bosinney's arm, coming from the conservatory at the end of the room. Her eyes were raised to his, as though answering some question he had asked, and he was gazing at her intently. Soames looked again at June. Her hand rested on old Jolyon's arm. She seemed to be making a request. He saw a surprised look on his uncle's face. They turned and passed through the door, out of his sight. The music began again, a waltz, and still as a statue in the recess of the window, his face unmoved, but no smile on his lips, Soames waited. Presently, within a yard of the dark balcony, his wife and Bosinney passed. He caught the perfume of the gardenias that she wore, saw the rise and fall of her bosom, the languor in her eyes, her parted lips, and a look on her face that he did not know. To the slow, swinging measure they danced by, and it seemed to him that they clung to each other. He saw her raise her eyes, soft and dark, to Bosinney's, and drop them again. Very white, he turned back to the balcony, and leaning on it, gazed down on the square. The figures were still there looking up at the light with dull persistency, the policeman's face too, upturned and staring, but he saw nothing of them. Below, a carriage drew up, two figures got in and drove away. That evening June and old Jolyon sat down to dinner at the usual hour. The girl was in her customary high-necked frock. Old Jolyon had not dressed. At breakfast she had spoken of the dance at Uncle Roger's. She wanted to go. She had been stupid enough, she said, not to think of asking anyone to take her. It was too late now. Old Jolyon lifted his keen eyes. June was used to go to dances with Irene as a matter of course, and deliberately fixing his gaze on her, he asked, "Why don't you get Irene?" No. June did not want to ask Irene. She would only go if her grandfather wouldn't mind just for once for a little time. At her look, so eager and so worn, old Jolyon had grumblingly consented. He did not know what she wanted, he said, with going to a dance like this, a poor affair, he would wager, and she no more fit for it than a cat. What she wanted was sea air, and after his general meeting of the Globular Gold Concessions he was ready to take her. She didn't want to go away? Ah! She would knock herself up. Stealing a mournful look at her, he went on with his breakfast. June went out early and wandered restlessly about in the heat. Her little light figure that lately had moved so languidly about its business was all on fire. She bought herself some flowers. She meant to look her best. He would be there. She knew well enough that he had a card. She would show him that she did not care. But deep down in her heart she resolved that evening to win him back. She came in flushed and talked brightly all lunch. Old Jolyon was there, and he was deceived. In the afternoon she was overtaken by a desperate fit of sobbing. She strangled the noise against the pillows of her bed, but when at last it ceased, she saw in the glass a swollen face with reddened eyes and violet circles round them. She stayed in the darkened room till dinner time. All through that silent meal the struggle went on within her. She looked so shadowy and exhausted that old Jolyon told Sankey to countermand the carriage. He would not have her going out. She was to go to bed. She made no resistance. She went up to her room and sat in the dark. At 10 o'clock she rang for her maid. "Bring some hot water, and go down and tell Mr. Forsyte that I feel perfectly rested. Say that if he's too tired I can go to the dance by myself." The maid looked askance, and June turned on her imperiously. "Go," she said. "Bring the hot water at once." Her ball dress still lay on the sofa, and with a sort of fierce care she arrayed herself, took the flowers in her hand, and went down, her small face carried high under its burden of hair. She could hear old Jolyon in his room as she passed. Bewildered and vexed, he was dressing. It was past 10. They would not get there till 11. The girl was mad. But he dared not cross her. The expression of her face at dinner haunted him. With great ebony brushes he smoothed his hair till it shone like silver under the light, then he too came out on the gloomy staircase. June met him below, and without a word they went to the carriage. When, after that drive which seemed to last for ever, she entered Roger's drawing room, she disguised under a mask of resolution a very torment of nervousness and emotion. The feeling of shame at what might be called running after him was smothered by the dread that he might not be there, that she might not see him after all, and by that dogged resolve, somehow she did not know how, to win him back. The sight of the ballroom with its gleaming floor gave her a feeling of joy, of triumph, for she loved dancing, and when dancing she floated. So light was she, like a strenuous, eager little spirit. He would surely ask her to dance, and if he danced with her, it would all be as it was before. She looked about her eagerly. The sight of Bosinney coming with Irene from the conservatory, with that strange look of utter absorption on his face, struck her too suddenly. They had not seen, no one should see, her distress, not even her grandfather. She put her hand on Jolyon's arm and said very low, "I must go home, Gran. I feel ill." He hurried her away, grumbling to himself that he had known how it would be. To her he said nothing, only when they were once more in the carriage, which by some fortunate chance had lingered near the door, he asked her, "What is it, my darling?" Feeling her whole slender body shaken by sobs, he was terribly alarmed. She must have blank to-morrow. He would insist upon it. He could not have her like this. There, there. June mastered her sobs, and squeezing his hand feverishly, she lay back in her corner, her face muffled in a shawl. He could only see her eyes, fixed and staring in the dark, but he did not cease to stroke her hand with his thin fingers. End of Part 2, Chapter 8. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Part 2, Chapter 9 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 9. Evening at Richmond. Other eyes besides the eyes of June and of Soames had seen "those two," as Euphemia had already begun to call them, coming from the conservatory. Other eyes had noticed the look on Bosinney's face. There are moments when Nature reveals the passion hidden beneath the careless calm of her ordinary moods: violent spring flashing white on almond blossom through the purple clouds, a snowy moonlit peak with its single star soaring up to the passionate blue, or, against the flames of sunset, an old yew tree standing dark guardian of some fiery secret. There are moments, too, when in a picture gallery a work, noted by the casual spectator as Titian, remarkably fine, breaks through the defences of some Forsyte, better lunched perhaps than his fellows, and holds him spellbound in a kind of ecstasy. There are things, he feels, there are things here which are things. Something unreasoning, unreasonable, is upon him when he tries to define it with the precision of a practical man. It eludes him, slips away, as the glow of the wine he has drunk is slipping away, leaving him cross and conscious of his liver. He feels that he has been extravagant, prodigal of something. Virtue has gone out of him. He did not desire this glimpse of what lay under the 3 stars of his catalogue. God forbid that he should know anything about the forces of nature. God forbid that he should admit for a moment that there are such things. Once admit that, and where was he? One paid a shilling for entrance, and another for the programme. The look which June had seen, which other Forsytes had seen, was like the sudden flashing of a candle through a hole in some imaginary canvas, behind which it was being moved. The sudden flaming out of a vague, erratic glow, shadowy and enticing. It brought home to onlookers the consciousness that dangerous forces were at work. For a moment they noticed it with pleasure, with interest, then felt that they must not notice it at all. It supplied, however, the reason of June's coming so late and disappearing without dancing, without even shaking hands with her lover. She was ill, it was said, and no wonder. But here they looked at each other guiltily. They had no desire to spread scandal, no desire to be ill-natured. Who would have? And to outsiders no word was breathed, unwritten law keeping them silent. Then came the news that June had gone to the seaside with old Jolyon. He had carried her off to Broadstairs, for which place there was just then a feeling, Yarmouth having lost caste in spite of Nicholas, and no Forsyte going to the sea without intending to have an heir for his money such as would render him bilious in a week. That fatally aristocratic tendency of the first Forsyte to drink Madeira had left his descendants undoubtedly accessible. So June went to the sea. The family awaited developments. There was nothing else to do. But how far had those two gone? How far were they going to go? Could they really be going at all? Nothing could surely come of it, for neither of them had any money. At the most a flirtation, ending as all such attachments should, at the proper time. Soames's sister, Winifred Dartie, who had imbibed with the breezes of Mayfair—she lived in Green Street—more fashionable principles in regard to matrimonial behaviour than were current, for instance, in Ladbroke Grove, laughed at the idea of there being anything in it. The little thing—Irene was taller than herself, and it was a real testimony to the solid worth of a Forsyte that she should always be a little thing. The little thing was bored. Why shouldn't she amuse herself? Soames was rather tiring, and as to Mr. Bosinney, only that buffoon George would have called him the Buccaneer. She maintained that he was very chic. This dictum, that Bosinney was chic, caused quite a sensation. It failed to convince. That he was good-looking in a way, they were prepared to admit. But that anyone could call a man with his pronounced cheekbones, curious eyes, and soft felt hats chic, was only another instance of Winifred's extravagant way of running after something new. It was that famous summer when extravagance was fashionable, when the very earth was extravagant, chestnut trees spread with blossom, and flowers drenched in perfume as they had never been before, when roses blew in every garden, and for the swarming stars the nights had hardly space, when every day and all day long the sun, in full armour, swung his brazen shield above the park, and people did strange things, lunching and dining in the open air. Unprecedented was the tale of cabs and carriages that streamed across the bridges of the shining river, bearing the upper middle class in thousands to the green glories of Bushey, Richmond, Kew, and Hampton Court. Almost every family with any pretensions to be of the carriage class paid one visit that year to the horse chestnuts at Bushey, or took one drive among the Spanish chestnuts of Richmond Park. Bowling smoothly, if dustily, along in a cloud of their own creation, they would stare fashionably at the antlered heads which the great slow deer raised out of a forest of bracken, that promised to autumn lovers such cover as was never seen before. And now and again, as the amorous perfume of chestnut flowers and of fern was drifted too near, one would say to the other, "My dear, what a peculiar scent!" And the lime flowers that year were of rare prime, near honey-coloured. At the corners of London squares they gave out, as the sun went down, a perfume sweeter than the honey-bees had taken, a perfume that stirred a yearning unnameable in the hearts of Forsytes and their peers taking the cool after dinner in the precincts of those gardens to which they alone had keys. And that yearning made them linger amidst the dim shapes of flower beds in the fading daylight, made them turn and turn and turn again, as though lovers were waiting for them, waiting for the last light to die away under the shadow of the branches. Some vague sympathy evoked by the scent of the limes, some sisterly desire to see for herself, some idea of demonstrating the soundness of her dictum that there was "nothing in it," or merely the craving to drive down to Richmond, irresistible that summer, moved the mother of the little Darties, of little Publius, of Imogen, Maud, and Benedict, to write the following note to her sister-in-law: "Dear Irene, June 30th. I hear that Soames is going to Henley to-morrow for the night. I thought it would be great fun if we made up a little party and drove down to Richmond. Will you ask Mr. Bosinney, and I will get young Flippard. Emily," they called their mother Emily, it was so chic, "will lend us the carriage. I will call for you and your young man at 7 o'clock. Your affectionate sister, Winifred Dartie. Montague believes the dinner at the Crown and Sceptre to be quite eatable." Montague was Dartie's second and better known name, his first being Moses, for he was nothing if not a man of the world. Her plan met with more opposition from Providence than so benevolent a scheme deserved. In the first place, young Flippard wrote: "Dear Mrs. Dartie, awfully sorry, engaged too deep. Yours, Augustus Flippard." It was late to send into the byways and hedges to remedy this misfortune. With the promptitude and conduct of a mother, Winifred fell back on her husband. She had indeed the decided but tolerant temperament that goes with a good deal of profile, fair hair, and greenish eyes. She was seldom or never at a loss, or, if at a loss, was always able to convert it into a gain. Dartie, too, was in good feather. Erotic had failed to win the Lancashire Cup. Indeed, that celebrated animal, owned as he was by a pillar of the turf, who had secretly laid many thousands against him, had not even started. The 48 hours that followed his scratching were among the darkest in Dartie's life. Visions of James haunted him day and night. Black thoughts about Soames mingled with the faintest hopes. On the Friday night he got drunk, so greatly was he affected, but on Saturday morning the true Stock Exchange instinct triumphed within him. Owing some hundreds, which by no possibility could he pay, he went into town and put them all on concertina for the Saltdown Borough Handicap. As he said to Major Scrotton, with whom he lunched at the Iseeum, that little Jew boy Nathan had given him the tip. He couldn't care a curse. He was in a mucker. If he didn't come up, well, then damme, the old man would have to pay. A bottle of Paul Roget to his own cheek had given him a new contempt for James. It came up. Concertina was squeezed home by her neck, a terrible squeak, but, as Dartie said, there was nothing like pluck. He was by no means averse to the expedition to Richmond. He would stand it himself. He cherished an admiration for Irene, and wished to be on more playful terms with her. At 5:30 the Park Lane footman came round to say Mrs. Forsyte was very sorry, but one of the horses was coughing. Undaunted by this further blow, Winifred at once dispatched little Publius, now aged 7, with the nursery governess to Montpellier Square. They would go down in hansoms and meet at the Crown and Sceptre at 7:45. Dartie, on being told, was pleased enough. It was better than going down with your back to the horses. He had no objection to driving down with Irene. He supposed they would pick up the others at Montpellier Square, and swap hansoms there. Informed that the meet was at the Crown and Sceptre, and that he would have to drive with his wife, he turned sulky and said it was damned slow. At 7 o'clock they started, Dartie offering to bet the driver £0.50 he didn't do it in the 3/4 of an hour. Twice only did husband and wife exchange remarks on the way. Dartie said: "It'll put Master Soames's nose out of joint to hear his wife's been driving in a hansom with Master Bosinney." Winifred replied: "Don't talk such nonsense, Monty." "Nonsense!" repeated Dartie. "You don't know women, my fine lady." On the other occasion he merely asked: "How am I looking? A bit puffy about the gills? That fizz old George is so fond of is a windy wine." He had been lunching with George Forsyte at the Haversnake. Bosinney and Irene had arrived before them. They were standing in one of the long French windows overlooking the river. Windows that summer were open all day long, and all night too, and day and night the scents of flowers and trees came in, the hot scent of parching grass and the cool scent of heavy dews. To the eye of the observant Dartie, his two guests did not appear to be making much running, standing there close together without a word. Bosinney was a hungry-looking creature, not much go about him. He left them to Winifred, however, and busied himself to order the dinner. A Forsyte will require good, if not delicate, feeding, but a Dartie will tax the resources of a Crown and Sceptre. Living as he does, from hand to mouth, nothing is too good for him to eat, and he will eat it. His drink, too, will need to be carefully provided. There is much drink in this country, not good enough for a Dartie. He will have the best. Paying for things vicariously, there is no reason why he should stint himself. To stint yourself is the mark of a fool, not of a Dartie. The best of everything. No sounder principle on which a man can base his life, whose father-in-law has a very considerable income and a partiality for his grandchildren. With his not unable eye, Dartie had spotted this weakness in James the very first year after little Publius's arrival, an error. He had profited by his perspicacity. 4 little Darties were now a sort of perpetual insurance. The feature of the feast was unquestionably the red mullet. This delectable fish, brought from a considerable distance in a state of almost perfect preservation, was first fried, then boned, then served in ice, with Madeira punch in place of sauce, according to a recipe known to few men of the world. Nothing else calls for remark, except the payment of the bill by Dartie. He had made himself extremely agreeable throughout the meal, his bold, admiring stare seldom abandoning Irene's face and figure. As he was obliged to confess to himself, he got no change out of her. She was cool enough, as cool as her shoulders looked under their veil of creamy lace. He expected to have caught her out in some little game with Bosinney, but not a bit of it. She kept up her end remarkably well. As for that architect chap, he was as glum as a bear with a sore head. Winifred could hardly get a word out of him. He ate nothing, but he certainly took his liquor, and his face kept getting whiter, and his eyes looked queer. It was all very amusing. For Dartie himself was in capital form, and talked freely, with a certain poignancy, being no fool. He told 2 or 3 stories verging on the improper, a concession to the company, for his stories were not used to verging. He proposed Irene's health in a mock speech. Nobody drank it, and Winifred said: "Don't be such a clown, Monty." At her suggestion, they went after dinner to the public terrace overlooking the river. "I should like to see the common people making love," she said. "It's such fun." There were numbers of them, walking in the cool after the day's heat, and the air was alive with the sound of voices, coarse and loud, or soft as though murmuring secrets. It was not long before Winifred's better sense—she was the only Forsyte present—secured them an empty bench. They sat down in a row. A heavy tree spread a thick canopy above their heads, and the haze darkened slowly over the river. Dartie sat at the end, next to him Irene, then Bosinney, then Winifred. There was hardly room for four, and the man of the world could feel Irene's arm crushed against his own. He knew that she could not withdraw it without seeming rude, and this amused him. He devised every now and again a movement that would bring her closer still. He thought: "That buccaneer Johnny shan't have it all to himself. It's a pretty tight fit, certainly." From far down below on the dark river came drifting the tinkle of a mandolin, and voices singing the old round: "About, about, unto the ferry, for we'll go over and be merry, and laugh and quaff and drink brown sherry, and laugh and quaff and drink brown sherry." And suddenly the moon appeared, young and tender, floating up on her back from behind a tree, and as though she had breathed. The air was cooler, but down that cooler air came always the warm odour of the limes. Over his cigar, Dartie peered round at Bosinney, who was sitting with his arms crossed, staring straight in front of him, and on his face the look of a man being tortured. And Dartie shot a glance at the face between, so veiled by the overhanging shadow that it was but like a darker piece of the darkness, shaped and breathed on, soft, mysterious, enticing. A hush had fallen on the noisy terrace, as if all the strollers were thinking secrets too precious to be spoken. And Dartie thought: women. The glow died above the river, the singing ceased, the young moon hid behind a tree, and all was dark. He pressed himself against Irene. He was not alarmed at the shuddering that ran through the limbs he touched, or at the troubled, scornful look of her eyes. He felt her trying to draw herself away, and smiled. It must be confessed that the man of the world had drunk quite as much as was good for him. With thick lips parted under his well-curled moustaches, and his bold eyes aslant upon her, he had the malicious look of a satyr. Along the pathway of sky between the hedges of the tree-tops, the stars clustered forth. Like mortals beneath, they seemed to shift and swarm and whisper. Then on the terrace the buzz broke out once more, and Dartie thought: "Ah, he's a poor, hungry-looking devil, that Bosinney!" And again he pressed himself against Irene. The movement deserved a better success. She rose, and they all followed her. The man of the world was more than ever determined to see what she was made of. Along the terrace he kept close at her elbow. He had within him much good wine. There was the long drive home, the long drive and the warm, dark, and the pleasant closeness of the hansom cab, with its insulation from the world, devised by some great and good man. That hungry architect chap might drive with his wife; he wished him joy of her. And conscious that his voice was not too steady, he was careful not to speak, but a smile had become fixed on his thick lips. They strolled along towards the cabs awaiting them at the farther end. His plan had the merit of all great plans, an almost brutal simplicity. He would merely keep at her elbow till she got in, and get in quickly after her. But when Irene reached the cab, she did not get in; she slipped instead to the horse's head. Dartie was not at the moment sufficiently master of his legs to follow. She stood stroking the horse's nose, and to his annoyance Bosinney was at her side first. She turned and spoke to him rapidly, in a low voice. The words "that man" reached Dartie. He stood stubbornly by the cab step, waiting for her to come back. He knew a trick worth two of that. Here, in the lamplight, his figure, no more than medium height, well squared in its white evening waistcoat, his light overcoat flung over his arm, a pink flower in his buttonhole, and on his dark face that look of confident, good-humoured insolence. He was at his best, a thorough man of the world. Winifred was already in her cab. Dartie reflected that Bosinney would have a poorish time in that cab if he didn't look sharp. Suddenly he received a push which nearly overturned him in the road. Bosinney's voice hissed in his ear: "I am taking Irene back. Do you understand?" He saw a face white with passion, and eyes that glared at him like a wild cat's. "Eh?" he stammered. "What? Not a bit. You take my wife." "Get away!" hissed Bosinney, "or I'll throw you in the road." Dartie recoiled. He saw as plainly as possible that the fellow meant it. In the space he made, Irene had slipped by. Her dress brushed his legs. Bosinney stepped in after her. "Go on!" he heard the Buccaneer cry. The cabman flicked his horse. It sprang forward. Dartie stood for a moment, dumbfounded. Then, dashing at the cab where his wife was, he scrambled in. "Drive on!" he shouted to the driver, "and don't you lose sight of that fellow in front." Seated by his wife's side, he burst into imprecations. Calming himself at last with a supreme effort, he added: "A pretty mess you've made of it, to let the Buccaneer drive home with her. Why on earth couldn't you keep hold of him? He's mad with love. Any fool can see that." He drowned Winifred's rejoinder with fresh calls to the Almighty. Nor was it until they reached Barnes that he ceased a jeremiad, in the course of which he had abused her, her father, her brother, Irene, Bosinney, the name of Forsyte, his own children, and cursed the day when he had ever married. Winifred, a woman of strong character, let him have his say, at the end of which he lapsed into sulky silence. His angry eyes never deserted the back of that cab, which, like a lost chance, haunted the darkness in front of him. Fortunately, he could not hear Bosinney's passionate pleading, that pleading which the man of the world's conduct had let loose like a flood. He could not see Irene shivering as though some garment had been torn from her, nor her eyes black and mournful like the eyes of a beaten child. He could not hear Bosinney entreating, always entreating; could not hear her sudden soft weeping, nor see that poor hungry-looking devil, awed and trembling, humbly touching her hand. In Montpellier Square, their cabman, following his instructions to the letter, faithfully drew up behind the cab in front. The Darties saw Bosinney spring out and Irene follow, and hasten up the steps with bent head. She evidently had her key in her hand, for she disappeared at once. It was impossible to tell whether she had turned to speak to Bosinney. The latter came walking past their cab. Both husband and wife had an admirable view of his face in the light of a street lamp. It was working with violent emotion. "Good night, Mr. Bosinney," called Winifred. Bosinney started, clawed off his hat, and hurried on. He had obviously forgotten their existence. "There!" said Dartie. "Did you see the beast's face? What did I say? Fine games!" He improved the occasion. There had so clearly been a crisis in the cab that Winifred was unable to defend her theory. She said: "I shall say nothing about it. I don't see any use in making a fuss." With that view Dartie at once concurred. Looking upon James as a private preserve, he disapproved of his being disturbed by the troubles of others. "Quite right," he said. "Let Soames look after himself. He's jolly well able to." Thus speaking, the Darties entered their habitat in Green Street, the rent of which was paid by James, and sought a well-earned rest. The hour was midnight, and no Forsytes remained abroad in the streets to spy out Bosinney's wanderings, to see him return and stand against the rails of the square garden, back from the glow of the street lamps, to see him stand there in the shadow of trees, watching the house where, in the dark, was hidden she whom he would have given the world to see for a single minute, she who was now to him the breath of the lime trees, the meaning of the light and the darkness, the very beating of his own heart. End of Part 2, Chapter 9. Part 2, Chapter 10 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Man of Property by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 10. Diagnosis of a Forsyte. It is in the nature of a Forsyte to be ignorant that he is a Forsyte. But young Jolyon was well aware of being one. He had not known it till after the decisive step which had made him an outcast. Since then the knowledge had been with him continually. He felt it throughout his alliance, throughout all his dealings with his second wife, who was emphatically not a Forsyte. He knew that if he had not possessed in great measure the eye for what he wanted, the tenacity to hold on to it, the sense of the folly of wasting that for which he had given so big a price, in other words, the sense of property, he could never have retained her, perhaps never would have desired to retain her with him throughout all the financial troubles, slights, and misconstructions of those 15 years, never have induced her to marry him on the death of his first wife, never have lived it all through, and come up, as it were, thin, but smiling. He was one of those men who, seated cross-legged like miniature Chinese idols in the cages of their own hearts, are ever smiling at themselves, a doubting smile. Not that this smile, so intimate and eternal, interfered with his actions, which, like his chin and his temperament, were quite a peculiar blend of softness and determination. He was conscious, too, of being a Forsyte in his work, that painting of water-colours to which he devoted so much energy, always with an eye on himself, as though he could not take so unpractical a pursuit quite seriously, and always with a queer uneasiness that he did not make more money at it. It was, then, this consciousness of what it meant to be a Forsyte that made him receive the following letter from old Jolyon with a mixture of sympathy and disgust. Sheldrake House, Broadstairs, July the 1st. My dear Joe, the Dad's handwriting had altered very little in the 30-odd years that he remembered it. We have been here now a fortnight, and have had good weather on the whole. The air is bracing, but my liver is out of order, and I shall be glad enough to get back to town. I cannot say much for June. Her health and spirits are very indifferent, and I don't see what is to come of it. She says nothing, but it is clear that she is harping on this engagement, which is an engagement and no engagement, and goodness knows what. I have grave doubts whether she ought to be allowed to return to London in the present state of affairs, but she is so self-willed that she might take it into her head to come up at any moment. The fact is, someone ought to speak to Bosinney and ascertain what he means. I'm afraid of this myself, for I should certainly rap him over the knuckles. But I thought that you, knowing him at the club, might put in a word, and get to ascertain what the fellow is about. You will, of course, in no way commit June. I shall be glad to hear from you in the course of a few days whether you have succeeded in gaining any information. The situation is very distressing to me. I worry about it at night. With my love to Jolly and Holly, I am, your affectionate father, Jolyon Forsyte. Young Jolyon pondered this letter so long and seriously that his wife noticed his preoccupation and asked him what was the matter. He replied, nothing. It was a fixed principle with him never to allude to June. She might take alarm. He did not know what she might think. He hastened, therefore, to banish from his manner all traces of absorption. But in this he was about as successful as his father would have been, for he had inherited all old Jolyon's transparency in matters of domestic finesse. And young Mrs. Jolyon, busying herself over the affairs of the house, went about with tightened lips, stealing at him unfathomable looks. He started for the club in the afternoon with the letter in his pocket, and without having made up his mind. To sound a man as to his intentions was peculiarly unpleasant to him, nor did his own anomalous position diminish this unpleasantness. It was so like his family, so like all the people they knew and mixed with, to enforce what they called their rights over a man, to bring him up to the mark, so like them to carry their business principles into their private relations. And how that phrase in the letter, "You will, of course, in no way commit June," gave the whole thing away. Yet the letter, with the personal grievance, the concern for June, the rap over the knuckles, was all so natural. No wonder his father wanted to know what Bosinney meant, no wonder he was angry. It was difficult to refuse, but why give the thing to him to do? That was surely quite unbecoming. But so long as a Forsyte got what he was after, he was not too particular about the means, providing appearances were saved. How should he set about it, or how refuse? Both seemed impossible. So, young Jolyon. He arrived at the club at 3 o'clock, and the first person he saw was Bosinney himself, seated in a corner, staring out of the window. Young Jolyon sat down not far off, and began nervously to reconsider his position. He looked covertly at Bosinney sitting there unconscious. He did not know him very well, and studied him attentively for perhaps the first time. An unusual-looking man, unlike in dress, face, and manner to most of the other members of the club. Young Jolyon himself, however different he had become in mood and temper, had always retained the neat reticence of Forsyte appearance. He alone among Forsytes was ignorant of Bosinney's nickname. The man was unusual, not eccentric, but unusual. He looked worn too, haggard, hollow in the cheeks beneath those broad high cheekbones, though without any appearance of ill health, for he was strongly built, with curly hair that seemed to show all the vitality of a fine constitution. Something in his face and attitude touched young Jolyon. He knew what suffering was like, and this man looked as if he were suffering. He got up and touched his arm. Bosinney started, but exhibited no sign of embarrassment on seeing who it was. Young Jolyon sat down. "I haven't seen you for a long time," he said. "How are you getting on with my cousin's house?" "It'll be finished in about a week." "I congratulate you." "Thanks. I don't know that it's much of a subject for congratulation." "No?" queried young Jolyon. "I should have thought you'd be glad to get a long job like that off your hands. But I suppose you feel it much as I do when I part with a picture, a sort of child." He looked kindly at Bosinney. "Yes," said the latter more cordially. "It goes out from you, and there's an end of it. I didn't know you painted." "Only water‐colours. I can't say I believe in my work." "Don't believe in it? Then how can you do it? Work's no use unless you believe in it." "Good," said young Jolyon. "It's exactly what I've always said. By the by, have you noticed that whenever one says good, one always adds, 'It's exactly what I've always said'? But if you ask me how I do it, I answer, 'Because I'm a Forsyte.'" "A Forsyte? I never thought of you as one." "A Forsyte," replied young Jolyon, "is not an uncommon animal. There are hundreds among the members of this club, hundreds out there in the streets. You meet them wherever you go." "And how do you tell them, may I ask?" said Bosinney. "By their sense of property. A Forsyte takes a practical, one might say a common sense view of things, and a practical view of things is based fundamentally on a sense of property. A Forsyte, you will notice, never gives himself away." "Joking?" Young Jolyon's eye twinkled. "Not much. As a Forsyte myself, I have no business to talk, but I'm a kind of thoroughbred mongrel now. There's no mistaking you. You're as different from me as I am from my Uncle James, who is the perfect specimen of a Forsyte. His sense of property is extreme, while you have practically none. Without me in between, you would seem like a different species. I'm the missing link. We are, of course, all of us the slaves of property, and I admit that it's a question of degree. But what I call a Forsyte is a man who is decidedly more than less a slave of property. He knows a good thing, he knows a safe thing, and his grip on property, It doesn't matter whether it be wives, houses, money, or reputation. It's his hallmark." "Ah," murmured Bosinney, "you should patent the word." "I should like," said young Jolyon, "to lecture on it. Properties and quality of a Forsyte. This little animal, disturbed by the ridicule of his own sort, is unaffected in his motions by the laughter of strange creatures, you or I. Hereditarily disposed to myopia, he recognises only the persons of his own species, among which he passes an existence of competitive tranquillity." "You talk of them," said Bosinney, "as if they were half England." "They are," repeated young Jolyon, "half England, and the better half too, the safe half, the 3% half, the half that counts. It's their wealth and security that makes everything possible, makes your art possible, makes literature, science, even religion possible. Without Forsytes, who believe in none of these things and habitats, but turn them all to use, where should we be? My dear sir, the Forsytes are the middlemen, the commercials, the pillars of society, the cornerstones of convention, everything that is admirable." "I don't know whether I catch your drift," said Bosinney, "but I fancy there are plenty of Forsytes, as you call them, in my profession." "Certainly," replied young Jolyon. "The great majority of architects, painters, or writers have no principles like any other Forsytes. Art, literature, religion, survive by virtue of the few cranks who really believe in such things, and the many Forsytes who make a commercial use of them. At a low estimate, 3/4 of our Royal Academicians are Forsytes, 7/8 of our novelists, a large proportion of the press. Of science I can't speak. They are magnificently represented in religion. In the House of Commons perhaps more numerous than anywhere. The aristocracy speaks for itself. But I'm not laughing. It is dangerous to go against the majority. And what a majority!" He fixed his eyes on Bosinney. "It's dangerous to let anything carry you away. A house, a picture, a woman." They looked at each other, and though he had done that which no Forsyte did, given himself away, young Jolyon drew into his shell. Bosinney broke the silence. "Why do you take your own people as the type?" said he. "My people," replied young Jolyon, "are not very extreme, and they have their own private peculiarities like every other family. But they possess in remarkable degree those two qualities which are the real tests of a Forsyte: the power of never being able to give yourself up to anything, soul and body, and the sense of property." Bosinney smiled. "How about the big one, for instance?" "Do you mean Swithin?" asked young Jolyon. "Ah! in Swithin there is something primeval still. The town and middle class life haven't digested him yet. All the old centuries of farm work and brute force have settled in him, and there they've stuck, for all he's so distinguished." Bosinney seemed to ponder. "Well, you've hit your cousin Soames off to the life," he said suddenly. "He'll never blow his brains out." Young Jolyon shot at him a penetrating glance. "No," he said, "he won't. That's why he's to be reckoned with. Look out for their grip. It's easy to laugh, but don't mistake me. It doesn't do to despise a Forsyte. It doesn't do to disregard them." "Yet you've done it yourself." Young Jolyon acknowledged the hit by losing his smile. "You forget," he said, with a queer pride. "I can hold on too. I'm a Forsyte myself. We're all in the path of great forces. The man who leaves the shelter of the wall—well, you know what I mean. I don't," he ended, very low, as though uttering a threat, "recommend every man to go my way. It depends." The colour rushed into Bosinney's face, but soon receded, leaving it sallow brown as before. He gave a short laugh, but left his lips fixed in a queer, fierce smile. His eyes mocked young Jolyon. "Thanks," he said, "it's deuced kind of you. But you're not the only chaps that can hold on." He rose. Young Jolyon looked after him as he walked away, and resting his head on his hand, sighed. In the drowsy, almost empty room, the only sounds were the rustle of newspapers, the scraping of matches being struck. He stayed a long time without moving, living over again those days when he, too, had sat long hours watching the clock, waiting for the minutes to pass. Long hours full of the torments of uncertainty, and of a fierce, sweet aching, and the slow, delicious agony of that season came back to him with its old poignancy. The sight of Bosinney with his haggard face and his restless eyes, always wandering to the clock, had aroused in him a pity with which was mingled strange, irresistible envy. He knew the signs so well. Whither was he going? To what sort of fate? What kind of woman was it who was drawing him to her by that magnetic force which no consideration of honour, no principle, no interest could withstand, from which the only escape was flight? Flight? But why should Bosinney fly? A man fled when he was in danger of destroying hearth and home, when there were children, when he felt himself trampling down ideals, breaking something. But here, so he had heard, it was all broken to his hand. He himself had not fled, nor would he fly if it were all to come over again. Yet he had gone further than Bosinney, had broken up his own unhappy home, not someone else's. And the old saying came back to him: a man's fate lies in his own heart. In his own heart. The proof of the pudding was in the eating. Bosinney still had to eat his pudding. His thoughts passed to the woman whom he did not know, but the outline of whose story he had heard. An unhappy marriage. No ill treatment, only that indefinable malaise, that terrible blight which killed all sweetness under heaven, and so, from day to day, from night to night, from week to week, from year to year, till death should end it. But young Jolyon, the bitterness of whose own feelings time had assuaged, saw Soames's side of the question too. Whence should a man like his cousin, saturated with all the prejudices and beliefs of his class, draw the insight or inspiration necessary to break up this life? It was a question of imagination, of projecting himself into the future beyond the unpleasant gossip, sneers, and tattle that followed on such separations, beyond the passing pangs that the lack of sight of her would cause, beyond the grave disapproval of the worthy. But few men, and especially few men of Soames's class, had imagination enough for that. A deal of mortals in this world, and not enough imagination to go round. And, sweet heaven, what a difference between theory and practice! Many a man, perhaps even Soames, held chivalrous views on such matters, who, when the shoe pinched, found a distinguishing factor that made of himself an exception. Then, too, he distrusted his judgment. He had been through the experience himself, had tasted too the dregs of the bitterness of an unhappy marriage, and how could he take the wide and dispassionate view of those who had never been within sound of the battle? His evidence was too first hand, like the evidence on military matters of a soldier who has been through much active service, against that of civilians who have not suffered the disadvantage of seeing things too close. Most people would consider such a marriage as that of Soames and Irene quite fairly successful. He had money, she had beauty. It was a case for compromise. There was no reason why they should not jog along, even if they hated one another. It would not matter if they went their own ways a little, so long as the decencies were observed, the sanctity of the marriage tie, of the common home, respected. Half the marriages of the upper classes were conducted on these lines. Do not offend the susceptibilities of society. Do not offend the susceptibilities of the Church. To avoid offending these is worth the sacrifice of any private feelings. The advantages of the stable home are visible, tangible. So many pieces of property. There is no risk in the status quo. To break up a home is at the best a dangerous experiment, and selfish into the bargain. This was the case for the defence, and young Jolyon sighed. The core of it all, he thought, is property. But there are many people who would not like it put that way. To them it is the sanctity of the marriage tie. But the sanctity of the marriage tie is dependent on the sanctity of the family, and the sanctity of the family is dependent on the sanctity of property. And yet I imagine all these people are followers of one who never owned anything. It is curious. and again young Jolyon sighed. "Am I going on my way home to ask any poor devils I meet to share my dinner, which will then be too little for myself, or at all events for my wife, who is necessary to my health and happiness? It may be that, after all, Soames does well to exercise his rights, and support by his practice the sacred principle of property, which benefits us all, with the exception of those who suffer by the process." And so he left his chair, threaded his way through the maze of seats, took his hat, and languidly up the hot streets crowded with carriages reeking with dusty odours, wended his way home. Before reaching Wisteria Avenue, he removed old Jolyon's letter from his pocket, and tearing it carefully into tiny pieces, scattered them in the dust of the road. He let himself in with his key, and called his wife's name, but she had gone out, taking Jolly and Holly, and the house was empty. Alone in the garden, the dog Balthazar lay in the shade, snapping at flies. Young Jolyon took his seat there too, under the pear tree that bore no fruit. End of Part 2, Chapter 10.
Part 2, Chapter 11 of The Man of Property. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga, The Man of Property, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 11, Bosinney on Parole. The day after the evening at Richmond, Soames returned from Henley by a morning train. Not constitutionally interested in amphibious sports, his visit had been one of business rather than pleasure, a client of some importance having asked him down. He went straight to the city, but finding things slack, he left at 3 o'clock, glad of this chance to get home quietly. Irene did not expect him. Not that he had any desire to spy on her actions, but there was no harm in thus unexpectedly surveying the scene. After changing to park clothes, he went into the drawing-room. She was sitting idly in the corner of the sofa, her favourite seat, and there were circles under her eyes as though she had not slept. He asked, "How is it you're in? Are you expecting somebody?" "Yes, that is, not particularly." "Who?" "Mr. Bosinney said he might come." Bosinney. "He ought to be at work." To this she made no answer. "Well," said Soames, "I want you to come out to the Stores with me, and after that we'll go to the park." "I don't want to go out, I have a headache." Soames replied, "If ever I want you to do anything, you've always got a headache. It'll do you good to come and sit under the trees." She did not answer. Soames was silent for some minutes. At last he said, "I don't know what your idea of a wife's duty is. I never have known." He had not expected her to reply, but she did. "I have tried to do what you want. It's not my fault that I haven't been able to put my heart into it." "Whose fault is it then?" He watched her askance. "Before we were married you promised to let me go if our marriage was not a success. Is it a success?" Soames frowned. "Success?" he stammered. "It would be a success if you behaved yourself properly." "I have tried," said Irene. "Will you let me go?" Soames turned away. Secretly alarmed, he took refuge in bluster. "Let you go? You don't know what you're talking about. Let you go? How can I let you go? We're married, aren't we? Then what are you talking about? For God's sake, don't let's have any of this sort of nonsense. Get your hat on and come and sit in the park." "Then you won't let me go?" He felt her eyes resting on him with a strange, touching look. "Let you go?" he said. "And what on earth would you do with yourself if I did? You've got no money." "I could manage somehow." He took a swift turn up and down the room, then came and stood before her. "Understand," he said, "once and for all, I won't have you say this sort of thing. Go and get your hat on." She did not move. "I suppose," said Soames, "you don't want to miss Bosinney if he comes." Irene got up slowly and left the room. She came down with her hat on. They went out. In the park, the motley hour of mid-afternoon, when foreigners and other pathetic folk drive, thinking themselves to be in fashion, had passed. The right, the proper hour had come, was nearly gone, before Soames and Irene seated themselves under the Achilles statue. It was some time since he had enjoyed her company in the park. That was one of the past delights of the first 2 seasons of his married life, when to feel himself the possessor of this gracious creature before all London had been his greatest, though secret pride. How many afternoons had he not sat beside her, extremely neat, with light grey gloves and faint supercilious smile, nodding to acquaintances, and now and again removing his hat. His light grey gloves were still on his hands, and on his lips his smile sardonic, but where the feeling in his heart? The seats were emptying fast, but still he kept her there, silent and pale, as though to work out a secret punishment. Once or twice he made some comment, and she bent her head or answered "yes" with a tired smile. Along the rails a man was walking so fast that people stared after him when he passed. "Look at that ass," said Soames. "He must be mad to walk like that in this heat." He turned. Irene had made a rapid movement. "Hallo," he said, "it's our friend the Buccaneer." And he sat still with his sneering smile, conscious that Irene was sitting still, and smiling too. Will she bow to him, he thought? But she made no sign. Bosinney reached the end of the rails, and came walking back amongst the chairs, quartering his ground like a pointer. When he saw them he stopped dead, and raised his hat. The smile never left Soames's face. He also took off his hat. Bosinney came up, looking exhausted, like a man after hard physical exercise. The sweat stood in drops on his brow, and Soames' smile seemed to say, "You've had a trying time, my friend. What are you doing in the park?" he asked. "We thought you despised such frivolity." Bosinney did not seem to hear. He made his answer to Irene. "I've been round to your place. I hoped I should find you in." Somebody tapped Soames on the back, and spoke to him, and in the exchange of those platitudes over his shoulder he missed her answer, and took a resolution. "We're just going in," he said to Bosinney. "You'd better come back to dinner with us." And to that invitation he put a strange bravado, a stranger pathos. "You can't deceive me," his look and voice seemed saying. "But see, I trust you. I'm not afraid of you." They started back to Montpellier Square together, Irene between them. In the crowded streets Soames went on in front. He did not listen to their conversation. The strange resolution of trustfulness he had taken seemed to animate even his secret conduct. Like a gambler, he said to himself, "It's a card I dare not throw away. I must play it for what it's worth. I have not too many chances." He dressed slowly, heard her leave her room and go downstairs, and for full 5 minutes after dawdled about in his dressing room. Then he went down, purposely shutting the door loudly to show that he was coming. He found them standing by the hearth, perhaps talking, perhaps not, he could not say. He played his part out in the farce, the long evening through, his manner to his guest more friendly than it had ever been before, and when at last Bosinney went, he said, "You must come again soon. Irene likes to have you to talk about the house." Again his voice had the strange bravado and the stranger pathos, but his hand was cold as ice. Loyal to his resolution, he turned away from their parting, turned away from his wife as she stood under the hanging lamp to say good night, away from the sight of her golden head shining so under the light, of her smiling mournful lips, away from the sight of Bosinney's eyes looking at her, so like a dog's looking at its master. And he went to bed with the certainty that Bosinney was in love with his wife. The summer night was hot, so hot and still that through every opened window came in but hotter air. For long hours he lay listening to her breathing. She could sleep, but he must lie awake. And, lying awake, he hardened himself to play the part of the serene and trusting husband. In the small hours he slipped out of bed, and passing into his dressing room, leaned by the open window. He could hardly breathe. A night 4 years ago came back to him, the night but one before his marriage, as hot and stifling as this. He remembered how he had lain in a long cane chair in the window of his sitting room off Victoria Street. Down below, in a side street, a man had banged at a door, a woman had cried out. He remembered as though it were now, the sound of the scuffle, the slam of the door, the dead silence that followed. And then the early water cart, cleansing the reek of the streets, had approached through the strange-seeming useless lamplight. He seemed to hear again its rumble, nearer and nearer, till it passed and slowly died away. He leaned far out of the dressing-room window over the little court below, and saw the first light spread. The outlines of dark walls and roofs were blurred for a moment, then came out sharper than before. He remembered how that other night he had watched the lamps paling all the length of Victoria Street, how he had hurried on his clothes and gone down into the street, down past houses and squares, to the street where she was staying, and there had stood and looked at the front of the little house as still and grey as the face of a dead man. And suddenly it shot through his mind, like a sick man's fancy. What's he doing? That fellow who haunts me, who is here this evening, who's in love with my wife, prowling out there perhaps, looking for her as I know he was looking for her this afternoon, watching my house now, for all I can tell. He stole across the landing to the front of the house, stealthily drew aside a blind, and raised a window. The grey light clung about the trees of the square, as though night like a great downy moth had brushed them with her wings. The lamps were still alight, all pale, but not a soul stirred, no living thing in sight. Yet suddenly, very faint, far off in the deathly stillness, he heard a cry, writhing, like the voice of some wandering soul barred out of heaven and crying for its happiness. There it was again, again! Soames shut the window, shuddering. Then he thought, "Ah, it's only the peacocks across the water." End of Part 2, Chapter 11. Recording by Leanne Howlett.